Okay, so kind of an overview of the pistons I'm re-ringing. Obviously you can't re-ring pistons that are real scored up, and likewise the bore will be all scored up and you'll never be able to hone it back to within spec. But with these pistons and these cylinders, they were pretty good, so they honed up, so these are perfect candidates to re-ring. So if you've noticed, they're pretty clean, and what I did is I went around with steel wool around the piston top and the piston sides here to get them all good and clean. You don't want to use anything more abrasive than steel wool like sandpaper, because it'll eat away here at your piston and take material off, and that's not really what you're after. So, and one more thing here, if we can get this out, all these pistons are generally numbered. Sometimes they're numbered from the factory. You really can't see it, but there's a very faint 8 on both this rod and this rod cap. And you want to have these lined up. And a good way to tell your rod caps are on correctly is you see here that on each side of the rod cap, this lip is different. So you want to make sure you have the proper lip on the proper side of the rod. So, and then you want to put these back in the same place you got them out of, because from the factory this is a balanced rotating assembly with the flywheel. So if you can help it, you want to put it back together as close to original as you possibly can. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and install the rings. Now, it always helps to hold your piston in a vise, and I clamp onto the connecting rod, not too tight, just enough to hold it. But there's a lot of different ways people have of installing rings, and what I like to do is have them all opposing these two sides of the piston, as these get most of the frictional forces hit here, so you don't want the two ends coming together where there's a lot of friction. So, and that's how Ford does it as well. But how you go about doing it is you take your oiling ring first. You'll go ahead and throw that on, and I have that set towards the this is actually the front of the piston towards the front of the motor. So you want to have this oiling ring, the gap directly lined up in that orientation there. Then you take one of your oil retainer rings here, and these are pretty flexible, so you don't really have to worry about breaking them. Obviously you don't want to do anything too insane. So you get that dropped in there, and you want that in this orientation, so coming at this angle from where the piston is directionally. And then again with this next ring, you want it the opposite orientation. So that's pretty simple. Now, your upper and lower rings will usually be noted by your box here. See, we got the second groove and the top groove. So, and they're usually noted by a dot, and they show which side is to face up. So that's really important. You don't want to screw that up. So this second ring is kind of hard because these rings are pretty brittle. But if you're doing this at home and you don't have a ring compressor, you can kind of walk them on. And here's kind of the technique here. So you want to get this end started on the second ring, and then press the back end down, and it'll hop in. And then you want to rotate that in, and then you can grab the edge of this, the edge of that ring, and slide it right on in. So, and again, you want to verify that your dot is indeed facing up. So that's really important. Now in this particular set, these top rings have no top and bottom, so you don't have to really worry about any dot per se, so you just kind of slap that one on there, and that one's pretty easy. So that's pretty much how to install rings. So we'll go ahead and get all these pistons ringed up and installed into the engine now. Okay, so I almost forgot to show this part here, and I've already done this, but what you want to do is take your rings and actually put them into the bore and check them with a feeler gauge for the ring gap to see if you're within spec. So basically how you'd go about doing this is you just slide your ring in there, and then ideally you want to check this in 3 different places in the especially if you ran a hone through your cylinder versus having it bored. So you want to check it at the top, middle, and bottom. And what you do is, I got all the rings on my piston already except for this top one, so I really can't go much more than the top setting. But what you would do is you take your piston and then slide that ring in there, and the reason you use your piston is because it gets your ring set in there just nice and flat and straight in the bore. So then you take your feeler gauge and you take your reading, so we can fit that one in. Okay, and we cannot fit this one in, and this is the 18. Now if we go over and we look at the specs for a top ring, we show that it has to be between 10 and 20, and being at 18 we're at the upper end, but we're still within spec, and it's a little bit expected to be at the upper end given that this is a hone job. So, and that's another reason why when I went through my honing video I explained that you really don't want to take a whole lot out of these. If you got to take a lot out to make them straight, then you might as well have them bored, because then this comes up where you'll start passing oil, where your pistons and your rings will not be the right size for the bore that you now have. So with this engine we're still within spec, and you want to do this with all your rings. Your oil rings, you know, that's to your discrepancy. I generally don't always do that, but my compression rings I always do that with the top and second ring, and I usually like to find the best bore where they all fit the tightest to put them into. So that's kind of the idea there behind that. So I've already done all this, and I got the pistons all ringed up, so we're going to go ahead and install these pistons now. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and install our pistons on our budget small block. And you want to recheck your piston rings before you go ahead to install your piston to make sure that they're in the right orientation. And we went ahead and used the standard Ford alignment where the rings are offset 45 degrees from each other with the oiling ring in the center. So we saw that in the other video. So as you can see, we have the other pistons already installed. So what we're going to go ahead and do first is change our bearing out. So usually they'll come right out, but if they don't, you can always take a screwdriver and grab the lip that's right here on the bearing and give that a tap. And they'll usually come right out. You want to be careful not to damage your, there we go. You want to be careful not to damage the bearing mating surface. And when I knock them out, I like to hit on the opposite lip of the seating part of the bearing, so it rotates that out. As if you hit on that side, it'll scratch the bearing mating surface. So how we're going to go ahead and install our bearings is we're just going to line up that lip with the lip and the connecting rod cap. Just slide it in there. And do the same on the other side. Okay. Now, before you install your pistons, you want to go ahead and make sure your cylinder bore is free of all debris. So I've already went and cleaned that out with a rag, and you want to oil that up before you install your piston. So I like to just go around here with that oiler and run my hand down in the bore. Make sure I get good coverage. So I don't really want to scratch up the bore after we've gone ahead and done all that work to freshen it up. So before you insert your piston, you want to make sure that your crank is aligned so that it comes down to the center. So you want to get that rotated into the center. And you also want to move your other connecting rod over the side as far as it'll go so you don't run into it on the way down. So before we install our piston here, we're going to, while our hands are still oily, going to go ahead and put some assembly lube on the bearings. You don't need a lot because you have really tight clearances, so excessive amounts will just squish out anyway. So, and then I like to go ahead and oil up my oiling ring as well. And give a few quick squirts in here in the wrist pin. Kind of work that around. So you don't necessarily need to put a bunch of oil on your piston for the fact that you already have a ton of oil in the bore. So what you want is, usually Ford likes to mark their pistons, and the marks on the piston will usually always face the front of the motor. And it's real crucial that you do this correctly because the connecting rods can only go in one way. As you can see, there's quite a dramatic lip on the side of the connecting rod, and on the other side it's completely flat. The flat sides of the connecting rods are supposed to touch each other, and these lips face the journals. So, and another thing, like I've said previously, you want to, if you're doing a re-ring job, you want to install the pistons back in the original bores because this is a balanced rotating assembly. So it's always a good idea to keep it balanced by putting them back in the same place. And we're going to go ahead and stick some rubber hose on these connecting rod bolts so they don't scratch up our crank journal, or rod journal, excuse me. So, and then we're going to use a ring compressing tool after we've set our piston in there. And again, you want to check your rings to make sure they're all in the proper alignment because they do move around. Now what we're going to do is loosen up our tool and stick it right on over there. Now what I've found is a good method is to hold your hand over the top because you don't want this to rotate when you're tightening it down because it'll rotate your rings. So that's really all it takes, and we're just going to use the end of a rubber mallet get it here where we can watch our connecting rod coming in. We're just going to give that a few taps. It shouldn't take a lot of effort. It takes a lot of effort. You got something incorrect, be it your piston rings for your pistons or something, so it should go in really easy. Notice I'm not using a lot of force to tap this piston in. Now you want to guide the bottom of your connecting rod with your hands because you don't want to run it into your journal or bind up your bearing on the other connecting rod. So I previously mentioned to push that existing connecting rod over so that you can get the connecting rod you're working on currently incorrectly without damaging it. And pretty much from there, you want to have your bearing cap oiled up, and you want to match it up as well. This rounded off edge should face the crank and not the other connecting rod. That should just slide right on there. Slide right on there. And what you want to do with your connecting rod nuts is put a little oil on them so you can get an accurate torque rating when you torque them down, and you're not getting improper results due to drag. So, okay, once you have them snugged down with a wrench, you want to go ahead and rotate your crank over. And as you see, this should not take a whole lot of effort to rotate all the pistons over throughout the bores of the motor, and you should never feel much resistance. So obviously there's some because you have piston ring drag, and the more pistons you put on, the tighter it's going to get. But you want to check this with every piston you put in. If you have significant drag and you can't turn the motor over with one hand, then you have problems and you need to pull it back apart and reassess the situation. But from there, as we can see, our pistons all rotate, so we should be good to move on to the next step and torque our rod bolts down. So we'll get moving on to that. Okay, so we're going to finish off our crank and rod assembly here by torquing the rod bolts. And you can start from any which way you please, but I recommend that you do both that are beside each other at a time and work in an orderly fashion through them. So the torque spec for these rod bolts on the small block Ford, the 302, 289, and 260 style is 25 foot-pounds. So we're going to take them to 20 first. And we got our old school torque wrench. So we're just going to go on a two-step process since we have such a low torque value. So we're going to go to 20. And then we're going to go to 25. And then we'll go back and check our bolts to make sure that we're at 25, and you don't want to exceed your torque spec on these. So right at 25 is plenty, and then you want to go back and check them one last time to be sure. It's always good to double check everything. So we're at 25 there. And we're at 25 there. So you want to go through and do all your connecting rods in the same way. And once you're done, you want to double check them all again to make sure that you have them all torqued down correctly. And then at the end, you should be able to turn your engine over with relative ease. As I've said before, if it takes more than one arm to turn the motor over, you have problems, and you need to locate them and correct them before you can move on. So that's pretty much how to assemble the crank and rod assembly. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and install our oil pump. So We have one from Melling here, and we like to use the standard style. The higher pressure really isn't necessary for really anything. It draws a lot of horsepower, but that's open to opinion. But we're going to go ahead and use the standard. So what I like to do is put a little assembly lube on our oil pump drive shaft here, install that, and that helps to create a seal so it won't fall out when we're trying to set it in place. And what we want to do is make sure our mating surfaces are nice and free of oil. And we'll just drop our gasket down, and the shaft goes, you can see the light coming through down here, and our shaft needs to go right through that hole. So once you have the oil pump set in there, we're going to go ahead and take our bolts and put Loctite on them, because it's real important. We don't want our threads or our bolts coming loose from our oil pump, because then we lose oil pressure, because it is a gasketed part. So we're just going to go ahead and install those and run those down. And these torque to 25 foot-pounds. So we're going to go ahead and torque those down. And what you want to do is clean out the threads on this particular part, because the Loctite will not seal the oil. So you want to get in there with carb and choke cleaner and spray that out, and then blow that out with compressed air. Okay, so once you have your oil pump bolts run down and snug, you need to torque them down to 25 foot-pounds. Now it's a little tight to get in here, so what we're going to use a universal apex so that we can get into this tight space. And you want to keep your torsion to a minimum, because the more you angle your torque wrench with this apex, you'll lose accurate torque specs. So you want to go ahead and take these to 25 foot-pounds, and you want to take them to 20 first, and then to 25. So we're already at 20 on them. So now we're on 25 on both. So it's a little bit of a snug fit, but you can get in there and do it. So that's pretty much what you're after, and then your oil pump's installed. Now we're not going to go ahead and install our oil pump pickup, because we don't know exactly what pan we're going to run on this motor at this point. But the pickup that you run is dependent on the pan style, so we're going to hold off on that for now.